Vision of Vietnam would be permanent. As a nationalist and founder of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh was fast transforming North Vietnam. The party took control of almost every sphere of life. The reconstruction of the war-ravaged economy was pushed ahead at incredible speed. One of Ho Chi Minh's highest priorities was to get as much aid for North Vietnam as he could from the Soviet Union and China. In July 1955 in Moscow, he won promises of cash help for the North to stave off a food crisis. The Russians also pledged to send technicians and military advisors. At the same time, China meant to match or even better the Soviet offer. Although Ho Chi Minh's greatest ambition was to reunify North and South Vietnam, so far he had urged his followers to be patient. He had refused to back guerrilla warfare against the South. Both China and the Soviet Union were also insisting on caution. But by 1958, pressure to back an armed campaign was mounting. The tens of thousands of southern Viet Minh soldiers who came north after the Geneva Accords were by now restless and homesick. There was more pressure from inside the South, where the Viet Minh that had stayed behind were being wiped out by the new regime. In the northern government, an increasingly powerful faction of Southerners, led by Le Duan, the Communist Party General Secretary, was also arguing for strong measures. In January 1959, with Ho Chi Minh's blessing, the North Vietnamese Communist Party voted to support armed revolution in South Vietnam. To help the campaign, 4,500 Viet Minh Southerners were prepared for infiltration back into the South. By 1957, 2 years after taking power in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem had impressed the United States. He had used the army forcibly against gangsters and armed religious groups. It had looked for a while as if President Diem could create a viable non-communist state in South Vietnam and win the support of the southern people. In fact, Diem had no intention of introducing the democracy or the social reforms that the United States wanted. He unleashed a savage campaign against his political opponents, using the army and police to make mass arrests. There was widespread torture and summary executions. At the same time, Diem's own family built up enormous wealth and power, while most of the South Vietnamese continued to live in dire poverty. By September 1960, to the immense frustration of the United States, which was pouring in aid, Diem's regime was detested by vast numbers of South Vietnamese. There was already virtual civil war, with armed rebellions breaking out all over the country. Increasingly, the revolts were being led by nationalist and communist guerrillas, and some trained men infiltrated down from the north. Over 12 months, 1,400 local government officials and civilians were killed, and a further 700 kidnapped. In South Vietnam, the guerrillas began to mount bold attacks on military posts, convoys, and railways. As events in South Vietnam spiraled towards chaos, in January 1961, John F. Kennedy took office as the 35th President of the United States. Almost at once, Kennedy faced a series of Cold War crises. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was preparing to resume atmospheric testing of atomic weapons. Khrushchev also promised to increase Russian support for communism around the world. The climax came in August 1961 with a tense standoff in Europe as the Russians sealed off East Berlin and began to build the Berlin Wall. Kennedy's reaction to the sense of mounting threat was to order a massive strengthening of American defenses. He ordered the call-up of 150,000 military reservists. A program was launched to build public nuclear fallout shelters right across the United States. There was a surge in arms production, especially of strategic nuclear weapons. With so many immediate crises demanding the attention of the president, Vietnam was far down the White House agenda. All the same, concern was growing. The South Vietnamese guerrillas were now 17,000 strong. In September 1961, there were 450 attacks, some involving hundreds of guerrillas at a time. Shortly after the decision to mount an armed revolution in South Vietnam, an organization had been created to control the military and political effort. This organization, the National Liberation Front, represented a wide range of political, ethnic, and religious groups. The military wing of the NLF was the People's Liberation Army. The army included guerrillas who had been sent down from North Vietnam, Viet Minh veterans, and local armed groups. The main purpose of the force was to support the political battle, and the civilian leaders of the front kept tight control. President Diem christened them the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, and the name stuck. The Viet Cong meant to follow the same kind of political and military strategy that had won the war against the French. Politics, diplomacy, and violence would be carefully coordinated so each always worked with the others. For the time being, military activity would take second place to the political effort. Many hoped that a full-scale war would never be necessary.